Now, we've heard about the rise of Sinn Féin from Michael Laffan. We're now going to hear about the opposite side of that coin, which is the decline of the Irish Parliamentary Party. This is a zero-sum game, I'm afraid. And we have, as our speaker on this topic, the acclaimed biographer of John Redmond, Dermot Meleady. Over to you, Dermot. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, this is a paper on the Irish provincial press and the changes in nationalist public opinion between 1916 and 1918. The consensus among historians has been that between 1916 and 1918, a nationalist public opinion which was initially hostile to the Easter Rebellion was transformed by the executions into retrospective romanticisation of and support for the rebels, leading to an overwhelming transfer of support from the Irish Party to Sinn Féin in the 1918 general election. Now, in this paper, I will test this conclusion by following the editorial commentary in provincial newspapers between the rebellion and the election. The study is based on the editorials of a sample of 33 such newspapers on the key events in Irish politics in those years. The papers were chosen for their circulation and geographical spread. For example, the Midland Tribune, published in Birr, would have circulated in Kings County, Queens County, Westmeath, Tipperary and East Galway. The full list of papers is there in slide 1. I tried to even them out roughly per head of population in the 4 provinces, but I left out Dublin newspapers, so obviously the Irish Independent and Freeman's Journal are not included, even though they would have circulated almost nationwide, especially the Independent. So there should be some kind of rough proportionality of newspapers to head of population, but please don't analyse it too closely mathematically. Now, we take the press reactions to the Dublin Rebellion. Sorry, I should have also said these are all weekly papers with 2 exceptions. The Cork Examiner was a daily, and in nationalist Ulster, the Irish News is also a daily. So taking the reactions to the Easter Rebellion first, in common with the Dublin Castle authorities, the police, and the great majority of Ireland's population, the provincial newspapers were caught completely off guard by the news of the rebellion in Dublin. Difficulties in communicating with the capital hampered their initial reporting. An editorial comment where it was expressed began in the first week in May, the week after the end of the rebellion, when the first executions of rebel leaders had already taken place. Now, I'll begin by examining the coverage of 6 issues in this commentary. So, Joseph, the next slide, please. Thanks. Now, on the rebellion itself, the first bar on the left, we're talking about a total sample of 33 papers. And you can see that 22 of the newspapers commented on the rebellion. Now, outright condemnation of the rebellion was voiced by only 2 of the sample. The Anglo-Celt, or Anglo-Celt, described it as a criminal enterprise. The Westmeath Examiner called it the deepest act of treachery to the nation's interests, which almost mirrored almost exactly Redmond's own rhetoric on the rebellion. But most newspapers preferred to fix on the foolishness or the recklessness of the action. It was the work of a small section of intellectual fanatics in the view of the Carlow nationalist, or the lunacy of the Sinn Féiners in the view of the Tuam Herald. Some would express no disapproval. Claire Champion said it was not for us to sit in judgment. There was no time to waste words in useless moralising, said the Kilkenny people. Now, taking the second bar, when it came to attributing extenuating circumstances to the rebellion, the picture was very different. 24 of the 33 newspapers mentioned the Ulster Unionists' threats to resist by force the imposition of Home Rule on Ulster. The Westmeath Examiner wrote that Sir Edward Carson had set the example for the 1916 rebels by defying the law and making force the supreme arbiter. So that's the second bar there. 22 of the newspapers commented with extenuation of the rebellion by referring to Ulster. The third bar is the executions themselves. And the striking thing about this third bar is that a mere 11 of the 33 papers had anything to say about the executions, either questioning them or criticising them. The spectrum went from acceptance to anger. The Belfast Irish News wrote that with the final executions of Connolly and MacDermott, the signatories of the proclamation have now paid the penalty of their rashness and folly. Another Ulster paper, the Donegal Vindicator, made the angriest comment, and it wrote that the sight of Irishmen shot in cold blood by England's soldiers has made the whole nation see red. But yet this was actually a paper that would stand by the Irish Parliamentary Party until the very end. It was so this was a purely rhetorical outburst from this paper. In fact, another striking thing is that all but one of the papers criticising the executions were papers that would stay, if you like, loyal to Redmond and to the Irish Party right to the end of 1918. Eight of the newspapers in the fourth bar there, 8 of the newspapers made pleas for clemency, such as the Limerick Leader, which wrote that on the 10th of May, it said that 12 executions were enough and it was time for clemency. Now, coming to the fourth, I'll just take some water here. Coming to the fourth bar deals with expressions of confidence in Redmond, the party, and Home Rule. In the midst of the emotions generated by the executions and the arrests of suspected partisans of the rebels, it was notable that 20 of 28 papers not already hostile to the Irish Party expressed their confidence in the Irish Party and in John Redmond during the month of May. There were eight were silent, but 20 expressed confidence. The Clare Champion, for example, a paper which was destined to switch its allegiance to Sinn Féin later on, that praised the, quote, superhuman endeavours of the sorely tried Irish leader, meaning John Redmond. The fifth bar is attitude to the Home Rule Act itself, that as on the statute book since 1914. So this was a related question to that of confidence in the party. And for 2 years, the Irish Independent, the nationally read Irish Independent, had boasting a national circulation 7 times greater than that of its rival, the Freeman's Journal, had carried a string of trenchant editorials criticising what it saw as the inadequacies of the Home Rule Act and of the Irish Party's weakness in accepting these inadequacies. So was this negativity reflected in the provincial papers? Well, one paper, the Kerryman, which was a very Republican paper, did write that Redmond's Home Rule Act is hopeless. But as we see there in the fifth bar, the fifth bar is the reverse. It shows that only 5 papers expressed. We're looking at the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 7th bar on the left. 7 papers, 7 of the newspapers reported and commented as if the Act on the statute book remained the only viable political option for Ireland. Typical of this were the Connacht Tribune, which looked forward to the Act being in operation without undue delay, the Clare Champion, which insisted that the Act was still on the statute book and we mean to keep it there. All this was in line with attitudes between the outbreak of the war and the rebellion, when candidates who were pledged to Home Rule had won all 6 by-elections held in those 20 months. Finally, included in the 7th bar there is attitudes to financial aspects of the Home Rule Act. The Independent had long been the principal voice within nationalism, arguing for full fiscal autonomy. It argued that political autonomy was meaningless without significant revenue-raising powers, and it called the Home Rule Act's financial provisions profoundly disappointing. So did this campaign influence the regional press? Judging by the coverage of the financial issue, it had little effect. Only 6 of the 33 papers carried any reference to the financial inadequacies of the Home Rule Act or protested against war taxation. The Kilkenny People warned that before the rebellion, a month before the rebellion, that excessive new war taxation in the forthcoming budget would severely hamper the operation of Home Rule. And the Roscommon Herald was explicitly critical of the Act itself, writing that as it stood, it was unworkable from the point of view of finance. But it's perhaps significant that all 6 of these papers which criticised the finances of the Act were already opposed to the party or would shortly switch allegiance to Sinn Féin. So these papers were in a small minority of this sample anyway. Now, moving on to the summer of 1916, the big event of that summer of June and July was the new Home Rule Initiative, initiated at Westminster and carried out through the action of Lloyd George. Following the end of the executions and Asquith's visit to Dublin in mid-May, a new political initiative began to emerge at Westminster. All sides accepted that the status quo of suspended Home Rule was no longer viable. Even Tory MPs and newspapers with Irish-American opinion in mind were willing to support a new initiative to settle the question. Redmond and T.P. O'Connor saw a chance to take advantage of the new mood with a view to immediate implementation of the Home Rule Act. John Dillon, by contrast, was dubious and wary. Lloyd George took charge of a new round of shuttle negotiations between the parties, which would take up from the point at which the Buckingham Palace negotiations of 1914 had broken down. When news of the Lloyd George initiative emerged in late May, almost all the papers expressed hopes for a positive outcome for the nationalist cause. But it was soon clear that the terms of the proposals included, along with the immediate operation of the Home Rule Act, the exclusion of a 6-county block, including the majority nationalist counties of Fermanagh and Tyrone. The full representation of Irish MPs was to remain at Westminster, and all of this was to be on a provisional basis for the rest of the war and for 1 year afterwards, and thereafter until the UK Parliament came to make permanent arrangements. During June, Redmond and Carson both succeeded separately with great difficulty in selling these terms to their respective followers. Against fierce opposition from the Ulster Catholic bishops and the Irish Independent, a conference of nationalists in Belfast voted to accept them by 475 votes to 265. So we have the next one, please. Now, this is how the editorial comment played out on this initiative. Just ignore the first 2 bars because they are repeats of what was on the previous slide. But the commentary begins with the 3rd bar. All but 2, that's 31 of 33 newspapers, carried editorials on the new proposal, and their response was uniformly hostile to the partition element. And it divided, the 31 papers divided between 19 who rejected it outright and another 12 who rejected it with a certain amount of reservation. The 19 who rejected it outright contained 4 of the 5 Ulster nationalist papers, the exception being the Irish Daily News. It also contained all 5 of the papers already opposed to the party. So the Anglo-Celt, for example, wrote that it was all bound to end in disaster. The Donegal Vindicator voiced similar sentiments. We will not have it. We will have home rule, pure and simple, without qualification or dismemberment. Ireland demands it and England must give it. For the Westmeath Independent, cutting off a piece of Ulster from the rest would be, quote, an outrage that would cry to heaven for vengeance. If they had to choose between martial law and bastard home rule, by all means, let us have martial law. So that was 19 of that 21 of that 31 papers that you see there in the third bar. Now, the other 12 papers, though equally opposed to partition, they took a more measured approach. They urged calm and continued trust in the Irish party leadership. For the Sligo Champion, nationalists must be practical, and coercing the Ulster Unionists was a bad idea. 3/4 of Ireland in Irish hands is, quote, not bad for a start. The Longford Leader wrote that if the nationalists of Ulster were willing to accept the proposals, we fail to see why the Catholics and nationalists of the South and West should complain. The Cork Examiner even went so far as to praise the high ideals and lofty patriotic spirit behind the nationalist vote at the Belfast Conference. The Limerick Leader applauded its unselfish patriotism. That's the unselfish patriotism of the Northern nationalists. What happened then, as we know, was that in late July, due to pressure, as was said this morning, in late July, the whole scheme collapsed because a bunch of Southern Unionists in the British cabinet used their influence to have the provisionality of the proposal changed to permanence. That was a bridge too far for Redmond and Dillon to accept. Redmond was then forced to pull out of the deal. Carson did nothing to scupper the deal. Redmond was forced to pull out when the British government enshrined permanence in the new legislation. This meant that Redmond was now seen to have conceded partition, but had nothing to show for it. No Home Rule bill was going to be implemented. So an angry Redmond withdrew from the negotiations and announced that he would engage in no further negotiations. From this point on, there was complete paralysis. No further progress could be made because it was now clear that the only basis on which Home Rule could be obtained was with a partition clause excluding six-county Ulster. So this was a critical turning point. So the last two bars on that slide there show the newspaper reaction to the breakdown of the talks. And basically it divided along the lines of whether Redmond and the Irish Party should be blamed or not. In other words, whether all the blame should be put on the British government for betrayal and perfidy and so on, or whether Redmond and the party should share the blame. Almost all the papers, we move on now to the last slide. Yeah, we now have a divide beginning in this group of 33 newspapers. In column 1, there are 16 newspapers which remained loyal to the Irish Party right up to the 1918 general election. In column 2, we have 9 newspapers which had been loyal up to now to the Irish Party, but now between late 1916 and the middle of 1917, they switched allegiance, they embraced the policy of Sinn Féin and abandoned advocacy of the Irish Party. We have one paper in number 3, one paper which remained neutral. We have another paper which had been neutral but two more. That's the Limerick Echo and the Tipperary Star, which swung to Sinn Féin from a position of neutrality. When I say neutrality here, what I'm really talking about is they were papers that didn't tend to praise the Irish Party overly. They tended to concentrate on non-political matters, had little to say about political stuff, but they were galvanised into a new political awareness by the events of the summer, and specifically by the partition issue. Finally, in column 5, we have 5 newspapers which had been always, if you like, hostile to the Irish Party. And these include 2 which were really IRB papers, the Kerry Man and the Mayo News. The Cork Examiner, just to take one example of Group 1 papers that blamed the British government, Cork Examiner wrote that Asquith and Lloyd George had acted with deplorable weakness. The episode would reinforce the feeling that Englishmen were not to be trusted. The Munster Express was relieved that the hateful abortion which the Cabinet was hatching is stillborn. By that it meant partition. So the Munster Express was a paper it's in column 1. It remained loyal to the party, but it was glad that the scheme had been scuppered and that partition would not come into being. Nevertheless, the Munster Express, in remaining loyal, it gave generous coverage to Redmond's visit to Waterford when, in the following October, it called his royal and most enthusiastic reception in his constituency of Waterford City. Now, for all of the 9 papers in Group 2, the entire episode of the Lloyd George negotiations, the entire debacle, we might say, was the catalyst in their abandonment of support for the Irish Party, their gravitation to a radical critique of constitutional nationalism. And it likewise prompted the 3 neutral papers in Group 4 to gravitate to Sinn Féin. Now, for these papers, it was as if a taboo had been lifted on criticism of the party leadership. It was as if editors suddenly felt free to voice sentiments that they had long repressed. The Kilkenny People said that it was now clear that the Ulster bishops, who had opposed the deal back in June, were absolutely right. Mr. Redmond and his colleagues absolutely wrong. Worst of all, from Redmond's personal point of view, was the volte-face of the Waterford News, which is there in column 2. The Waterford News, the paper of his own constituency, which until recently had treated him like royalty. Following the collapse, it went so far as to state that it was now perfectly clear that the alleged provisional character of the exclusion of Ulster was a false statement. And Mr. Redmond, it will be observed, has not resigned. So it is difficult to know how Irish nationalists can place further confidence in those who have so grossly deceived them. The paper then practically ignored Redmond's visit to the city in October and just mentioned that there were very few of the general public about. The Tipperary Star wrote that Redmond had been too easy, too hopeful, too trustful, too gentlemanly, if you like, and he is now suffering from it, for it. The 5 newspapers in Group 5 had no motives of loyalty to the Irish Party to mollify their opposition to the Lloyd George proposals. The Roscommon Herald, the idiosyncratic owner and editor of the Roscommon Herald, Jasper Tully, was a disaffected former party MP who made no secret of his antagonism to the leadership. His paper mixed militant pro-war sentiment with anti-party invective, and it greeted the breakdown with the heading "A Burst Bubble," claiming that Mr. Redmond was constrained by the force of Irish public opinion to drop any further association with this sad business. The most extreme newspapers, I'll just take one of them, the Mayo News wrote under the heading "The Great Betrayal." It greeted the proposals with a storm of hyperbole. It said that Lloyd George's proposals for the dismemberment of the Irish nation had found willing tools in the Irish Party to accomplish his difficult task. They had, quote, sold their country as Judas sold his God. Redmond, as a leader of the Irish people, has become impossible. Moving to the events of 1917, the year was only 6 weeks old when the by-election in North Roscommon delivered the Irish Party its first electoral defeat since its reunification in 1900. and this was followed by another defeat in early May by a narrow margin in South Longford. Now, it's important that between these two by-elections came a debate in the House of Commons on the 7th of March on a motion from T.P. O'Connor, which called on the government to confer free institutions on Ireland. O'Connor was drawing on the recent speech of Woodrow Wilson, which had set out the principles of self-determination and government by consent, which John Bruton referred to this morning. These principles which must guide the post-war reorganisation of Europe. Lloyd George replied that the British people were determined to confer self-government on the parts of Ireland which demanded it, but it would fly in the face of self-determination to compel the anti-Home Rule population of the North East to submit to the rule of an Irish Parliament. Now, this is something that these statements of Lloyd George are often erased from the commentary here in this country. Lloyd George is just generally vilified. The word cynical was used about him this morning by Bertie Ahern, but I think not enough credence is given to the fact that although he was a very wily operator, there can only have been a certain amount of sincerity in what he said about self-determination. What he was really saying was that, yes, the principle of self-determination should apply to Ireland, but it must apply to two different parts of Ireland. This was something new, something which hadn't appeared in the rhetoric up to then. And of course, it was not accepted by any wing of Irish nationalists. This debate, the debate in March ended with Redmond leading the party in a walkout from the House of Commons. But it laid bare the real nature of the obstacle blocking the implementation of the Home Rule Act. No longer was it the prolongation of the war, as might have seemed to be the case in 1915 or early 1916. Partition now loomed as the inescapable accompaniment of any Home Rule implementation. The defeat in South Longford in May can be taken, at least in part, as a response of grassroots nationalists to the outcome of that debate, which was aided by a last-minute anti-partition letter from 18 bishops, including 15 Catholic bishops. Now, in Group 1, in the Group 1 newspapers, editorial reaction in this group reflected the feelings in the Irish Party and the United Irish League. The Connacht Tribune registered its anger and despair at the refusal of Lloyd George to coerce Ulster. In the Group 2 newspapers, the Carlow Nationalist, which had been willing to accept 3/4 of a loaf the previous year, now warned that every square inch of Irish soil belongs to the Irish nation. And it wrote that South Longford was the handwriting on the wall for the Irish Party. The Clare Champion lamented that Lloyd George's refusal to coerce Ulster had torn to shreds the Home Rule Act. Both groups united in rejecting Lloyd George's offer of Home Rule with partition in May 1917. They diverged on the value of the Irish Convention initiative in the same month. Group 1 newspapers threw their support with varying degrees of optimism behind the Irish Convention. Group 2 dismissed it as irrelevant in the new climate. In July came De Valera's landslide victory in East Clare. And we should remember, by the way, that landslide victory was held on the old franchise, not the new expanded franchise of 1918. So this was people who had previously voted for the Irish Party were now turning away from it in droves to vote for the Sinn Féin alternative. The Westmeath Examiner called the result a serious blow to the prestige of the Irish Parliamentary Party. If it was an indicator of general opinion, Ireland was about to plunge recklessly into the abyss of revolution. The Kilkenny People wrote that the De Valera win wrote of the win, East Clare has now held its court-martial and delivered its verdict, and that verdict is one of guilty against the Irish Party on a charge of high treason to Ireland. He, that's De Valera, and his party, not the Parliamentary Party, are the genuine spokesmen of Irish national sentiment. So by the autumn of 1917, the mould of newspaper opinion on the rush of political events had set into two opposed camps of roughly equal size. And this governed this coloured the perception and the commentary on all the subsequent events of that year, such as the death of Thomas Ashe in jail, the progress of the Irish Convention, and so on. Now, moving to 1918 events. How much? Overtime. I will just have to finish up. I'll have to skip past the events of 1918 to the conclusions. The conclusions of this study, contrary to the suggestions advanced by many historians and commentators, the evidence here suggests that the eclipse of the Irish Party and the decisive swing towards Sinn Féin in nationalist opinion was not the result of dissatisfaction with the 1914 Home Rule Act, or with its finances, or of dissatisfaction at its postponement, or of the prolongation of the war, or directly of the 1916 executions and martial law. Neither was it the result of the conscription crisis. The Irish Party's stand against conscription was as resolute as that of Sinn Féin. Rather, it was the consequence of the Ulster crisis and the issue of partition. Dillon, the leader of the party, reckoned without the almost complete collapse of morale within his own party. And that collapse was the effect of the combined failure of the two parliamentary debates of 1917 and 1918 and of the Irish Convention to deliver All-Ireland Home Rule by constitutional means. The late Conor Cruise O'Brien wrote in his memoir, it was not so much the loss of the counties themselves, but the unexpected flaw that had suddenly revealed itself in the whole Home Rule project, and at the very moment of its seeming triumph. Sinn Féin will be no more successful with the partition issue than had the Irish Party, but that was all in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dermot.